Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to be speaking about a research project that I did over a couple of months, aiming to establish what public perceptions of climate change in Kenya are through analysis of print media articles on climate change. So the title presentation is Mediating Climate Change, Understandings of Climate Change in Kenya Media. I'll open with this cartoon and article from about 4 years back that is a bit dismissive of climate change as a real issue. And it states Kenya shouldn't waste time drafting climate change laws, climate change mindful, and describes climate change as a bandwagon, a Western bandwagon, hitched up to a well-funded gravy train. And I'll come back to this towards the end to explore a bit more what this article might be trying to, if there's any work in what this article, how this article frames climate change. But in the space of 4 years, we've moved to this many articles. These are some headlines that I pulled from the research project that I did. And there's almost an explosion of the number of articles covering climate change in print media in the space of 4 years. Using the search function, I looked through the Nation Media Group website and used the search term climate change. That returned more than 3,000 articles containing climate change in some form, indicating that the concept has entered mainstream media more firmly today. And I'll explore more about the ways in which it has done so. So I've read articles from the Daily Nation, about 33 of them, from the East African, 9, and from the Standard, another national daily, 28 of them. So in total, I read about 70 articles between the dates 4th December of 2015 and 15th May of 2018. So that was my cut. So in this presentation, I'll focus on 4 trends that emerged from analysis of these articles and draw out some questions for further discussion on the ways in which climate change is discussed in Kenya. These trends are the types of articles that predominate print media on climate change, what opportunities are present in how climate change is framed, what the causes are detailed to be, and who, if anyone, is said to be to blame for climate change, and what solutions are offered and by whom. So what types of articles predominate on climate change? The majority of articles that I analyzed, almost half of them are opinion articles, which I found very fascinating. These include letters to the editor, opinion pieces, and commentaries. For both the Daily Nation and the Standard, the majority were opinion articles. Then the East African was different, in that the majority was science and health articles. This suggested to me a number of possibilities. One being that in-house news reporters may not have a strong focus on climate change, perhaps due to inexperience on reporting on the specifics and the nitty-gritty details of the content and context of climate change. It might also suggest that climate change is not politically expedient to speak about. And a recent example of this is visible in the recent news report on the MTV that did expose on the benefits of setting up a coal plant in Lamu a few weeks back. And if this is an issue that is being opposed by activists and community members, and the MTV, for those who don't know, has the ownership of the MTV has strong elements. It might also suggest that reporting on other issues such as politics and economics or detailed lives of people implicated in crime seem to be more important or tend to shift the focus away from issues of environment or climate. The opinion articles that I analyzed were written by a range of people, including members of the public, staff members of businesses such as Obesity Bank, Wrigley, East Africa, academics, NGO leaders such as the president of AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, president of the African Wildlife Foundation, the coordinator, national coordinator of the Kenya Forest Working Group, and so on. So opinion articles being the majority voice in climate change discourse presents both a risk and an opportunity, where the author might be a member of an organization with potential vested interests, such as the discovery revolution in Africa, the material that they write may skew popular perceptions of what causes of climate change are and what potential solutions to climate change will be. But they also present opportunities. So in opinion articles, the writers have a freer reign in the content that they do publish. Um, Many of these articles tended to have an action orientation to them more than articles that were written by in-house people. So they often gave solutions for climate change or gave ideas for what people could do to tackle or respond to climate change. And some of them, in fact, climate change an opportunity and a responsibility for all of us to do something. So in this space, more details on the causes and blames for climate change were also presented more frequently than in regular news articles. So the second thing I want to talk about is whether these articles were descriptive or evaluative and what opportunities might be being missed on either side. So the majority of articles that I analyzed tended to repeat what had been said in court, often by an institution like the World Bank or UNEP or academics at conferences attended. So paying attention though to how data and evidence was presented in these articles, I noticed that many of these articles had the words stated, state, showed, were the ones that were often used whenever they were citing, say, a report or something, or somebody that they had interviewed, as opposed to words like challenged, argued, asserted, discussed, claimed, which are more evaluative. There's a number of articles on climate change are syndicated from foreign news agencies, and this is just a snippet that I'm going to read out to you from one of those. This was reporting on Donald Trump pulling out of the Paris Accord. It says, I cannot in good conscience support a deal that punishes the United States, the world's leader in environmental protection, while imposing no meaningful obligations on the world's leading polluters, Trump said, before singling out China and India. This agreement is less about the climate and more about other countries gaining a financial advantage over the United States, he claimed. So in this piece, there was the use of the word claimed after Trump's assertion of unfairness in the Paris deal and the US being a leader in environmental protection. The news agency themselves are questioning or engaging critically with the material that they're including in their articles and not just presenting it or representing it unquestioningly. Where articles in Kenyan media, however, were evaluated, they tended to be downplaying the efforts of frontliners to adapt to or mitigate climate change. So the excerpts that I have on the screen feature interviews by food producers. One is a pastoralist and another is a farmer. There were not that many food producers interviewed in the majority of these articles. I'll come back to who is cited. In the first one, the pastoralist describes how he is confronting climate change, how he's dealing with it by changing his herd composition to include more camels and goats rather than cows. And in the other, the farmer describes the research she undertook that led her to establish her own seed bank of indigenous seeds that will be more resilient to climate fluctuations rather than relying on store-bought seeds. In the first excerpt, the pastoralist experience and success are reframed and dismissed. So there's a piece in there that says, like him, the pastoralist, Mr. Gawajide, thousands of pastoralists in Kenya hold on to livestock to the point of death because of prestige and tradition, but many are yet to learn how to withstand their advanced weather. And this comes right after this pastoralist says, I actually haven't lost any of my herd because I switched the composition of my herd. And in the second, the farmer's knowledge process that led her to come to this, to establish her own indigenous seed bank is not what the term research. I don't know if you will be able to see it, but where it talks about her research, the research is for influence. It's okay. So both of these lead to a situation of missed opportunities to uplift the adaptive and mitigating techniques and who provide answers to climate change in East Africa, and especially for people who are on the front line, dealing with the effects of climate change on the ground. It also means that newspapers' climate change reporting in Kenya tends to be not a space for critical discussion about what climate change is, who is responsible for it, how to confront it, and results in a narrative that is less politicized than in other international media. Leads me to this. So, cause and blame for climate change. Is the climate change narrative in Kenya politicized? Of the articles that I read, only 29% gave an explanation as to the cause of climate change, and 60 of these were opinion articles. The causes identified were varied, but all were linked to being man-made or human caused, and they are all kind of considered contributing factors to climate change. So there's carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, failure to protect the environment, fossil fuels, unwise economic growth. And then of these articles, only 25% assigned blame for climate change to anyone. And some of the blamed entities included wind, governments, corporations, rich nations, humans, but the majority entity that was assigned blame was in the negative in any of the articles that ventured down that territory. The entity often cited was not Africa, which leaves open the question of if not Africa, who is to blame them for and who is responsible for doing something about climate change. This raises the question of whether and why climate change is not politicized, or the ways in which climate change is approached differently in Kenyan media. And it seems like rather than a concern over who has contributed to climate change and what they should be doing to reduce their emissions, climate change reduction, the focus is on what those affected in Kenya could or should be doing, so adaptation and mitigation. And while this is understandable since the papers are aimed at a local audience, it's also, I think, an opportunity missed to engage in global politics and influence how we shape. Another possible reason why there's a lack of politics in the climate change conversation could be um, due to the sources whom journalists and other writers cite in their articles. The time period of the articles analyzed is during the period that the Paris Agreement was signed and when the Sustainable Development Goals were inaugurated. These two global events have likely influenced how local narratives of the environment and of climate change develop in Kenya. The majority of articles I analyzed cited UN institutions, reports, and academics. And even where independent authors were quoted in text, they also tended to cite UN statistics. And since both of these entities are often apolitical, it seems like the politics of climate change are left out of the conversation. Valuing what this is just a breakdown of what papers cited who. But valuing what this kind of orientation towards action less than discussion represents, it may be argued that a majority of the Kenyan population is less interested in discussing climate change and apportioning blame, which is a discussive process, such as in the COP meetings, whose slowness does not immediately result in tangible benefits and whose outcomes, laws and finances, are open to misappropriation by several parties, as a starting point suggested. So leaving aside high-level talks and legal mechanisms, many articles, and primarily opinion ones, focus on what can be done. And in some cases, what the authors themselves, as members of NGOs or businesses, who are doing. So solutions given include general advice, such as planting trees, which is a Kenyan favorite, raising forest cover to 10%, I think that's part of the National Climate Adaptation Plan, diversifying sources of energy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, adapting agriculture, shifting away from carbon-based production and consumption, legislation, finances, capacity building, increasing awareness of conservation. And all of these are kind of very general, yeah? They're not specific as these general solutions are not aimed at particular ecologies and do not evaluate where certain measures will be more effective than others, and who will implement these beyond the general government, and how exactly this will pan out. from the individuals writing their own opinion articles or giving examples of themselves, some specific advice did emerge, such as switching to e-board meetings to reduce travel committees from PCB staff with the PCB CEO, establishing an indigenous CFA at the farmers interview, changing head composition at the pastoralist interview, and even one getting more into the politics, dismissing political candidates who do not have a climate change agenda. So in conclusion, these are just like four broad themes. There's a space for climate change discussion that is being created and shaped by members of the public in the print media. This contains both opportunities to speak more freely about environmental concerns, which are often missing in the main bodies of print media, but also contains risks that vested interests may claim space to push their agendas. Climate change is a potential opportunity, as framed by many authors of opinion articles, and it's an opportunity for us to rise to the challenge of adaptation and mitigation in shaping how the whole region confronts this challenge and reclaims its resilience. But media narrative that uncritically prioritizes international organizations and government bodies for the lead on how to think about and discuss the issue kind of results in a lost opportunity of framing an endogenous conversation on climate change. Returning to the first section, what looks like a dismissal of climate change as a true occurrence. What looks like a dismissal of climate change as a true occurrence may be read more sensitively to be a critique of how climate change is approached in media and in the country more generally. Broadening the scope also, considering climate change representations in media and taking a few from the presence of so many opinion articles, perhaps an analysis of social media, which captures a lot of young people's discussing relevant issues in the country, and of activist movement actions also as a kind of media, may offer a climate change narrative that is critical, indigenous, and listening to media.
Hi, my name is Daisy, and I'm a private actually a current graduate actually student here at the area. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about government. Can you hear me by the way? Government climate policy in Kenya. So the purpose of this presentation is just basically to give a really brief overview of some key policy documents produced by the Kenya government, focused on climate change, and to offer some really their initial thoughts on the extent to which they both acknowledge and integrate an understanding of climate change as something that is experienced differentially at the sub-national level. And we kind of briefly touched upon that this morning. This is very much the early beginnings of the project, so I'll be only doing some really initial thoughts. That will be quite simple, but ultimately I need to think more about other people's experiences with these policies. If there's one takeaway out of this presentation, is that we should take time really to integrate critical discussion of policies into our broader popular discussions of climate change. It's important to really properly understand the strengths and the weaknesses of existing governmental policy in order both to be able to coordinate public NGO and government activity and to familiarise ourselves with the gaps of policy that really needs to be worked with. It's also important to keep an understanding of policy in the discussion so that we can keep government accountable to follow up on policy policies so it becomes actually meaningful. So ultimately, and for better or for worse, policy plays an inevitably central role in coordinating, framing, and incentivising strategies against climate change. So it is really crucial that we do take time to have a look at it. Okay, cool. So I've chosen to look at three really core policies. This is by no means comprehensive, but these are what I picked out to be some of the key ones to get a flavour of government policy. The first one being Kenya's intended nationally determined contribution. This sets out mitigation and adaptation goals that can contribute to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Board emissions reduction objective. And it's a response really to the decisions made at the 19th and 20th sessions of the Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC that invited the parties to communicate their INDCs to the Secretariat. So it's quite an important document, policy document, but also very externally facing. And secondly, the Kenyans National Adaptation Plan, which sets a direction and details actions to enable adaptation to climate strategy, to climate change over the period 2015-30, and it stems from the overall Kenya Vision 2030 strategy. And finally, the most recent document, Kenya's National Climate Change Action Plan, lays out a more detailed framework really for action following on from the other two, and it's actually accompanied by two really substantive technical analysis reports that present scientific projections of climate change impacts. Cool. So I'm interested really in just beginning to look critically at these policies with this core question in mind. So to what extent are these policies understanding of climate change really disaggregated at the subnational level? Firstly, this means seeing whether diversity in experiences of climate change across countries is acknowledged, first and foremost. And secondly, this really means seeing whether this translates into policy actions and setting up county governments with the appropriate resources to be able to make good on these policies. And by resources, I really mean access to information and adequate budget. But before we look at the policies, it's firstly good to really define why it's important that some national variation is included in these national policies. So, simply put, it's important because Kenya is a climatically and ecologically diverse country, as we all know and we discussed today. So really it follows that climate change policy should reflect this diversity. Understandings of climate change only operate at the national level will not reflect the more nuanced realities of differential effects and experiencing climate change, and thus will likely be well enough equipped to create and implement policies in the varying mitigation and adaptation needs and priorities across different regions. So in order to formulate an effective strategy against the heterogeneous realities of climate change in Kenya, it's so important that country disaggregated climate analysis is available and acknowledged, but also that it is actually integrated into implemented policy. Okay, so first I've looked at the INDC, limited as part of Kenya's efforts to fulfill the terms of the Paris Agreement. Most pressingly, alludingly, this policy limits total greenhouse gases by emissions by 30% by 2030, which is a really ambitious pledge. It also outlines the general aim to achieve a low carbon climate resilient development pathway, and it outlines some sectoral adaptation actions. On the one hand, it is following the requirements of the UNFCCC and fulfilling the obligations of the Constitution, declaring the strong commitment to mitigation and adaptation. And this can only be a really positive thing that it's included, and that's great. But on the other hand, there are limitations. It does not acknowledge at all, really, the subnational variation of in any way. Employing Kenya, a nation that is smallest geographic analysis all the way throughout. So following on this policies and breakdown actions by sub-plan or by county. And also, I noticed that actually hinges around the question of securing external financing in quite a noticeable way, which does make the term quite tentative and less committed. This is a policy document that makes it clear Kenya's climate strategy is dependent on external assistance rather than independent strategy and action, although it also needs to instrumentally to ensure necessary financing within the context in which it's produced. So I'm not sure. Ultimately, though, despite this being a flagship document on this climate commitment, it isn't grounded at all in the realities of the actual effects of climate change and the experiences on and impacts on the population. It is ultimately an outward-facing document, and the response to COP21 20 is intended audience of not the citizens of Kenya at all, but the international climate community. But really, nonetheless, a focus on the subnational would mean it's not realistic in terms of showing how these visions can be delivered, and it would demonstrate a more meaningful commitment to doing so. And the fact that the mention of subnational differences completely puts into question the extent to which regional disaggregated concerns are meaningfully used in the present policy agenda as a whole, especially because this policy is actually one of the ones that's most likely to represent the efforts of Kenya climate agenda in policy, international policy arena, and is actually probably most likely to be affecting all of the government accountable. So overall, although it is a nationally determined contribution, recognising the humanity of the challenges climate change poses to the diversity of planets and habitats would make it more helpful. Secondly, I've looked at the National Adaptation Plan. In terms of what it says, it includes a summary of the risks and vulnerability of different sectors nationally, and it outlines short, medium, and long-term actions for each sector nationally as well. This document is much more inwardly looking than the INDC, and it recognises smaller units of analysis such as caveat, which is really positive development. It acknowledges the need for counties to be involved in institutional coordination, structure, and implementation. And it actually lists devolution as one of the sectors it breaks down with, mentioning the need to conduct county-level mobility assessments as part of meeting the requirements of devolution. And it's really positive that it does take clearly the aim of analysis being at county level, and the biggest gap in that INDC. Really importantly, actually, it acknowledges studies that have shown differential vulnerability to climate change across the country. So here, we see it cites two data maps by Matthew and Matula these are both cited in the plan. One shows differential climate change risk for agro-climatic events in Kenya, and the other one illustrates the general vulnerability index. So the fact that these are included is a massive step of the INDC. This shows a kind of effort of recognising that it is a varied phenomenon that really varies across the country. And finally, it does acknowledge that arid and semi-arid land regions are particularly relevant to drought in response to fast track this existing framework that was actually started in 2013 but hadn't been implemented yet. Although this is all really positive and a huge step up from the INDC, I noted that it doesn't actually mainstream specific subnational variation in needs and priorities in the sectoral disaggregated action plan. At this stage, whilst it is acknowledged, which is really great and the first step, this is not meaningfully integrated into the action points going forward. Besides, it reiterates the existing EU framework. That's not yet been implemented. The action points remain entirely at the sectoral national level, despite on first glance it might look like it does understand a more nuanced needs of the So whilst it is positive that the policy talks assertively about involving county governments, the extent to which this county level focus is integrated is actually kind of focused more on processes of governance and of devolved governance and meeting the end of devolution, rather than improving the effectiveness of climate change action and having it employed for that ambition. It's important that countries do have the autonomy in shaping policies, I think, to meet their specific climatic needs, as opposed to really just gaining greater responsibility of the national policy. But again, we must really know and consider this that it's important that countries have the sufficient resources to be able to perform entirely and properly, both in terms of access to scientific projections about their counties and also to have budget control as well. And so finally, I looked at the National Climate Change Action Plan. And this is the government's most recent policy. And actually, I found the draft just now material offline, so I think it might be that recent, but it hasn't actually probably been finally released yet. And it sets out detailed action points accompanied by 2 really substantive technical analysis reports. This was participative and involved consultation with county governors. This most comprehensively integrates an understanding of some national nuance out of all the policies considered by a really long line. And the ATAR and the MTAR, the reports, provide really impressively detailed county-specific data. They're both like 200 pages long, and they're really detailed. So this is from the ATAR, the Adaptation Technical Analysis Report. And it gives a detailed projection from that report of changes in temperature and rainfall that's segregated by each county up until as far as the 1970s. Here is a graph that the ATAR cites that shows the maximum temperature projections for each respective county. This is a really positive resource for enabling counties to develop county integrated development plans that mainstream understandings of climate change that actually relate directly to their local environments. It's really interesting, actually, how counties are projected to have different trajectories over time. This could be worth having to look at another time. This is an insight that could be really useful if harnessed effectively, shaping policy. And secondly, another strength is that it requires all county integrated development plans to mainstream climate change and sets us out. However, although this again is leaps and bounds ahead of the other two policy documents and is really promising, I would say that it does still remain unclear whether mainstreaming into CIDPs means mainstreaming a national or a sub-national agenda. Although it seems to really thoroughly understand that different counties have different climate priorities, it isn't still clearly a commitment to making sure that CIDPs mainstream anything more detailed than Canada's national adaptation actions and policy roadmap. It's an important connecting step for the national government to actually make sure it provides a policy framework to enable a county's understanding of its climate priorities on one hand to be effectively carried over into their CIDP in a really meaningful way. But it does nonetheless seem that counties do have a really good idea of their own climate needs and priorities, which is great. These county-decided priorities were drawn up from a meeting that was called by the national government to inform the development of the NCCAP in March of this year. These are actually in the minutes of that meeting, not in the actual policy. It goes to demonstrate that there's incredible diversity in how each county is responding to climate change. Perhaps this could signal that the national government needs to play a role in standardising practice and responses, but also maybe standardising access to knowledge and resources to empower the county equally. But it is generally really important to recognise that these responses are becoming increasingly better, which is good. And impressively, 5 county governments have established county climate change funds as a designated part of their budget that identify, prioritise, and finance investments to reduce climate risk and achieve priorities of adaptation. I think it does appear, however, that this may be an effort coming from the counties themselves, and not necessarily coordinated effectively enough by national government or necessarily given enough emphasis by them, arguably. These activities here don't necessarily translate visibly into the national NCCAP that they were supposed to accompany council for. So some conclusions to round up. As you can see, there's a real clear trajectory of improvement as we look along the timeline of different policies, which is really promising. Acknowledgement of some national variation has got substantially better in these policies as time has gone on. So something must be going right. The government, however, needs to keep up this momentum really and integrate this increasingly nuanced understanding into the economic implemental policy. Local knowledge of climate needs should be taken seriously, and national policy should make it clear that CIDPs are required to maintain climate agenda that is sensitive to subnational particularities, not just implement existing national sectoral actions. But at the same time, we do need to look further at whether counties have the resources to be able to put this into action and reform their autonomy sufficiently, and really keep this at the whole time at the forefront of our analysis. And finally, operating at some national level needs really to go beyond the policy on the processes that involve governance as an end in itself. And work at this scale also with the aim of improving the effectiveness of climate change action. So really, I think the reason why we incorporate county governments into the policy process can be just as important as we do so. Overall, these are just some very preliminary thoughts about people's experiences with the policy. But finally, I just wanted to say for the moment, I've only begun to evaluate government level climate policy in quite a limited way. This is purely in the light of concerns about including subnational nuances and policy understandings of climate change. And again, further research in physically evaluating the strength of governmental climate policy could be to consider these policies against a whole range of other criteria. Most notably, it would be really good to consider how well integrated discrete climate actions are into a broader climate agenda, and even intergovernmental climate and industrial policy at large. This passage from a study guide from Dugo and his colleagues illustrates the current cities concerned quite well, I think. He's talking about national climate change policy in Kenya. The policy was scattered, even disjointed and contradictory, thereby contributing rather to the inadequacy in addressing climate change and mitigation issues. For example, while the policy for forests emphasizes the need to increase tree cover, the livestock policy encourages livestock keepers to clear trees and rangelands to encourage grass growth. Various actors working in sectors related to the environment have noted the need to really harmonise these policies. So yeah, I think locating areas where government policies are conflicting and considering the ways that policies create more synergy between acts and conflicts of interests could be a necessary future agenda for research. Thank you.
Our final speaker for this panel is Dr. Thomas Smith.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Thomas Smucker from Ohio University. I'm a visiting researcher this year at the National University of Geography. I'd like to thank Professor Moore and the organizers, others who brought this forum together. So far. It's an East Africa discussion, and we've been rather Kenya-centric so far. I'm going to take us south to Tanzania. Neighbor. Nchi ya Kiswahili sanifu. Kinachopendeza sana. So the linguistic context is important. Yeah, I think it's one of the important aspects of what I'm going to talk about, and I think it helps us to think about what we can sort of learn from the Tanzania situation, or what we can kind of bring in terms of exploring the implications for what's going on in Kenya, some of the issues that Daisy just talked about. So I've been working with a large group, interdisciplinary group of Tanzania US investigators, looking at issues of local knowledge, local institutions, climate change, adaptation in the reference of Pari Mountains in Kilimanjaro, a project that we call Pari Kilimanjaro Local Knowledge and Climate Change Adaptation Project. So this is a project that has drawn on the expertise of geographers, cultural linguists, ecologists, and climatologists, and like some of the other researchers here, we were interested in looking at people's coping and adaptive responses to climate variability, understanding the interactions of local knowledge and local institutions in shaping those responses, and this question of how climate science can climate science findings along with local climate knowledge might be able to inform local adaptation priorities. But since I didn't have a lot of time, I'm going to sort of step back a little bit from that and offer some insights kind of more broadly about Tanzania's adaptation policy. So what I would like to share with you is some insights on how Tanzania's early policy discourse and priorities related to adaptation, represented in its National Adaptation Program of Action, SNAPA, and its more recent National Climate Change Strategy, present a particular institutional understanding of framing of climate change that is, I would argue, deeply deterministic in terms of the role of climate change in Tanzania's rural development, and just as importantly, a narrow technical and kind of depoliticized vision of what planned adaptation might entail. More than 20 years ago, James Ferguson introduced the notion of the anti-politics machine and explaining how exclusively technical discourses of development and simplified accounts of societies serve to erase the politics of development and create a chasm between external development agendas and local realities. When combined with the development of an expert climate change discourse in Kiswahili in the Tanzanian context, this institutional framing of adaptation may lead down a similar path as the one that Ferguson described with regards to development more broadly. So I'm going to briefly talk about three narratives that inform, that are really at the heart of adaptation policy discourses in Tanzania, and briefly touch on the problems of the development of kind of an expert Kiswahili climate change lexicon. And then I'll discuss the ways in which the top priority in the NAPA, identified in Tanzania's NAPA, of expanding irrigation into drylands, how that technical intervention confronts some complex local politics of resource access in one village site. If I can get through that in 10 minutes, So, all right, so three narratives that in Tanzania's NAPA and NCCS that inform climate change priorities. The first is the NAPA suggests that the NAPA and NCCS paint a stark picture of kind of undifferentiated rural poverty and vulnerability exacerbated by climate change. The NAPA suggests that climate change is a threat mainly to the agrarian population that still depends on subsistence agriculture for their daily livelihood. And so I just have kind of some illustrative quotes as I go through these slides, but this is kind of a theme that's developed throughout the document and informs the priorities. So we don't get in that notion of kind of an undifferentiated, rural area populated by subsistence producers. We have, there's no sense of sort of commercial engagement that many rural producers in Tanzania are engaged in. There's really no sense of people's agency, their responses to climate variability, some of the issues that Matthew talked about this morning. A second kind of piece of that, or sort of narrative that is developed in the document, is a framing of vulnerability to climate change that's entirely driven by, vulnerability and poverty that's entirely driven by climate change itself, with no role for the wider set of socioeconomic and political root causes of vulnerability. So there's no historical context, there's no history here, there's no sense of the wider political economy, the way in which Tanzania is differentiated, and the way that different regions fit into that larger political economy. So there really is like a kind of a naturalization of poverty, a naturalization of vulnerability. Everybody's kind of fine, and then climate change comes along and puts rural folks in a difficult position that they're in. And then the third one is around conflict, kind of singling out climate as a driver of conflict. Again, completely absent any discussion of institutions that mediate conflict and the way that communities themselves respond and engage in conflict resolution. And so, again, this issue of lack of agency, kind of the disappearance of institutions, and arguably the disappearance of politics altogether. So what these three narratives together do, these three narratives of undifferentiated view of rural poverty and vulnerability, the narrow and deterministic notion of climate change's role in poverty and vulnerability, and third, a similarly deterministic view of climate-induced conflict, is that they ignore local institutions and their roles in mediating resource access and resolving conflict. So these policy narratives have shaped visions and set priorities and influenced the way that national and local officials discuss climate change. In our project, we have examined local narratives of climate variability and change and how they vary along altitudinal gradients in northern Tanzania. But I'm not going to explore those now, but we'd be happy to share them to you after the session. But on this question of narratives, I do want to suggest that the public understanding of climate change and climate change adaptation is something that government does, has been shaped by the development of an expert climate change lexicon. The notion of mabadiliko tabianchi is a term that people have heard before, it probably creeps up sometime in the media. It's something that is quite widespread among in kind of policy circles in Tanzania. It's part of an elite technical climate change discourse, increasingly spoken by elected officials, bureaucrats, and NGO staff, but that so far has not resonated with people's experiential and lived knowledge of climate change. The creation of novel terms in Kiswahili to capture the emerging reality is a potentially an important and productive task, but in this case, one that appears widely perceived as part of an expert discourse that is distant from people's concerns, particularly in rural Tanzania. And this is something that we're still kind of developing with the linguist on our team. But we find that in the naming of climate change related programming, like RED Plus. Anybody know the acronym for RED Plus? Is Swahili translation of RED, the program to reduce emissions from degradation and deforestation. It's a very, very long Kiswahili sentence that refers to sort of mindless cutting of trees, and just really creates this picture of rural people as forest destroyers. So, there are some serious issues I think that need to be investigated here in this attempt to kind of create a Swahilification of climate change discourse. The combination of a distant technical climate change lexicon and a deterministic framing of climate change then suggests the potential for planned adaptation in Tanzania and probably elsewhere until some serious disconnects with local people's perceptions and their aspirations. So our project has examined the nexus of local knowledge and local institutions in sites that have spanned the altitudinal gradients across 4 districts in northern Tanzania. To provide a brief example of the institutional inequity dimensions of adaptation that are ignored in these policy discourses, I want to highlight some findings from one dryland village at the base of the Mount Mountains, Kyria village. I want to briefly contrast 2 sub-villages within Kyria. One that's predominantly Maasai, where herding is the primary land use and livelihood. One that has seen the other one which has seen a major influx of farmers, farm and irrigation scheme that was developed in the early 1990s. So within this one village, we have a sub-village in Mangaline B, which is predominantly agricultural. The population is from all over Tanzania, 30 different ethnic groups. And then the other sub-village, predominantly Maasai, with a long-term residents of Kyria. So we were engaged in many different kinds of data collection forums and workshops. In one such workshop, participants identified the primary means by which people have reduced the negative impacts of recent shifts in climate variability. And in the table, you can see that a mix of agronomic, environmental, and non-farm adaptive practices identified most important in mitigating climate risk in the 2 sub-villages. And what's most striking, despite the differences between the sub-villages, is that irrigation farming is identified by residents from both communities as the single most important adaptive practice undertaken in the recent past to lessen the impact of climate variability. In both communities, improved maintenance and expansion. In Kyria village, then there would appear to be compatibility between the national adaptation priority placed on irrigation expansion in dry land and the aspiration and existing adaptive practices at community level. However, further discussion reveals that farmers and herders from Mangaline A and B view adaptation through a lens in which procedural and distributive justice issues are deeply entwined with their aspirations related to these kinds of technical interventions in expanding irrigation. And these local equity concerns play out very clearly in the discussion of the village land use plan. You can see the map from that plan in digital form here, with the land use legend to the right. So these concerns play out clearly in discussions of the village land use plan, where district government is pursuing expansion of the existing irrigation scheme to protect people from the vagaries of semi-arid climate and future climate change. The map shows the proposed expansion of the current irrigated zone north along the Ruvu River into a Mangaline B. For the Maasai, equity concerns focus on the protection of the traditional calving areas